Hello, so in this iteration we want to implement the copying of the color that the user selects in the first screen to the second screen. As you can see in front of you, the two screens are completely independent. So if you are a member of the second screen, you do not know anything about the first screen and vice versa. But there's a bridge or a connection between the two. That bridge is the segue, the instance of the UI storyboard segue. So let's learn a little bit about that UI storyboard segue. So go to the documentation, UI storyboard segue. So here is the UI Storyboard Segue object. It's a member of the UI kit. It started in iOS 5. And this is what it can do. It gives you access the Segue attribute. So you can access the source view controller, the controller of the initial, the controller of the base, which in our case the first screen, the destination where the segue is going, and the identifier, which is the name that we give to the segue. When the segue performs, there is a function called perform to perform the, if you want to do that. There are some methods to override and some discussion here about initializing the segue and so on. We are not going to initialize the segue ourselves because it's initialized by the application delegate and the storyboard. This is done for us from the Xcode setup, so we don't have to worry about that. But we will use this destination view controller to retrieve a reference to the destination of the segue, and we can also use the identifier to know which segue is being launched. Our program here launches only one segue, so we're not really going to use it this time, but in other projects, when you have more than one segue coming from the screen, you would want to distinguish between them, and we'll play with that in project number 5. So I have two controllers, the color display view controller.swift, which controls the second screen, and view controller.swift, which controls the first screen. In the second controller, I need to create a color object so that through the segue, I can assign the color that's created here to the color object. So I'll start first with the controller of the second screen. So I'll go to the color display view controller.swift. And in that, I need to create or define a color object variable or property so that I can receive the color from the previous screen. This will have different values, can change, so I'll use var for it. And then I need to give it any name, so I will say, for instance, painting color or display color or user color, maybe just user color. Painting color. And then I need to give it either a type or initial value. So I'm going to give it a type, UI color. If I leave it like that, Xcode will object and say you're creating a variable that does not have initial value. I am not worried about this because I'm going to initialize its value and assign it through the segue. So I am guaranteed that when the segue executes, this will have a value. I mistyped here. But Xcode doesn't know that. So in order to tell Xcode, I know that it will have initial value and suppress that error, I'll add an exclamation mark here and say that go along with it, I know what I'm doing, kind of thing. Then while we are at it in the view, or not while we're at it, we'll do that later. So I created like a pocket in memory controlled by the second controller, the color display view controller, in order to receive the color value from the first controller. So now let's switch to view controller.swift. In viewController.swift, I'm gonna fold the function to kind of tell you the color, the user color is created here locally inside the change color method or the change color function. So keep that in mind. So here is the view.load, here is the change color. I want to be able to respond to the event before the segue launches. So I can come here and create, I want to override the function in UI view controller. If you go to the documentation and look for UI view controller, you will see one of the functions that it has here interacting with the storyboard. Here is one of them, is prepare for segue. And there are several others as well. So the view controllers, as you can see, a view controller has so many tasks and functions that it can do. No one memorizes those functions, but you need to be familiar with them and the kind of gist, the general idea, to be able to do the things that you, and to recognize and be able to know the capabilities that you have here. So there's a description here that tells you a little bit about the view controller, the view management, handling the controller. So this is by itself is a very good read. And then it starts to give you a description of the different configurations and the different tasks. One of the tasks is preparing for segue. And that is a function here called the prepare for segue. It says notifies the view controller that the segue is about to be performed, and give you a reference to the segue that's about to be performed, and the sender, the object that launched that segue, the controller that launched that segue, in case you want to do anything to that object. So I want to override that function. Override it meaning it's a function that I am not defining, but it is defined already in view controller, similar to view.load. So I will come here and say override space, and I'll say function, and then prepare for segue. So here is prepare for segue. I could also have said that by itself. So I didn't really need to write override or function anything. I could just type the prepare for segue and it will show as one of the functions. The reason it will show is because everything inside a UI view controller is also inside my class or a member of my class, because my class is built upon the UI view controller or extends the capabilities of the view controller or inherits the capabilities of the view controller. So I can just double click from here and Xcode will add everything, will add the override, add the function, and give me everything that I want. So inside prepare for segue, I need to do a couple of things. First, I need to retrieve a reference to the destination, because the destination of the segue is my color display view controller. Then I need to assign the color property in the destination to the selected color that the user creates. So two steps. The first step, a reference to the destination. The destination is part of the segue, as we saw in the documentation. So this is a different function from what we have used before. This is a function that has parameters, meaning that the function comes already with some data that whoever notified that function, which in this case the operating system, has provided it with some of those data. So the operating system tells the function what segue is about to be prepared or need to be prepared, and who is the controller that launched that segue. And the function receives them in a variable called segue of type UIStoryboardSegue, and a second variable called sender of any type. So this variable is what's important to me, the first one, the segue. because a UI storyboard segue has a reference to its destination, and this variable will now have a complete access or a connection to this segue. So the variable segue you see here, as if this one has an outlet connection to that segue that is done by the operating system for you. So I can use that segue to access everything in the segue that's about to be launched, including the destination view controller variable. And the destination view controller variable, as you can see, comes back as a UI view controller, which is a general type of UI view controller, but I want it to be specifically the type color display view controller. So I'll say as color display view controller. It's objecting to me here, and I'll show you why. So you have that, and it says as color display. And then I need to, since this is giving me a variable, let's see what it says, is not convertible. So it says you need to use an exclamation mark with the, with the as. So oh, sorry, that's messed up. Segue, and this one here needs an as. So the segue destination view controller retrieves the view controller reference, the as converted to this type, an exclamation mark suppresses the compiler's issue with the type casting or the type conversion that's happening here. If I leave it like that, I retrieved it, but it's gone away. I need to assign it to a memory location for that function so I can then use it later on. So I'll say let destination, I'm going to call that memory location destination equal. So the right side again retrieves the view control, the destination controller type, and then the assignment operator assign it here to memory. This is a very powerful statement. By this statement, I bridge the connection between these two. So now the first controller has a reference or has direct access or an outlet connection to the second controller. So now I have access to all the attributes and all the functions of the second controller from the first. So what do I need to do? I want to assign the color of the destination. So I want to say destination dot color, or did I call it user color? No, what did I call it? I called it painting color. So I want to say dot painting color. I want to assign this to the color from that the user selected. Now let me open the change color function. The color that the user selected is created here or constructed here in this variable user color. That is the variable that contains the color, and I want to assign it to painting color. Now you see the problem. The variable is created or defined with the let statement inside the boundaries or inside the body of the change color function. The scope of the variable, the rule of thumb, the scope of the variable is the block in which it is defined. A block here means that curly braces. So this user color is defined inside the curly braces or the body of the change color. Thus, it will live and die inside the change color. Or in other words, anything outside the body of change color will not have access to user color. So I need access to that user color. The only way to give access to user color is to assign it to something that has the scope of the entire class, that has a scope or that is defined in a body outside the body of both functions. So if I can create the color here inside the class scope, then I can use it in between. You can do one of two things. You can create a second color object similar to what we did in color display with a class scope, assign it in change color, and then assign it again here. Or you can change the scope of the change color by removing the let statement. So I'm going to delete the let statement from change color here and define it in the class scope. So I will define it over there. And when I'm going to define it over there, I'm not going to define it with let. So I'm going to say var userColor, and then I want to initialize it. So I say UIColor, and then I'll give it the exclamation mark. So now userColor, I changed its scope from the scope of the change color function to the scope of the class. So now I made it what I call instance variable. We made it instance variable, a variable with the scope of the instance of that class, not the scope of a function of the class. So now that userColor has been defined in the body of the class, I can easily reference it here. So I say userColor. So I'm assigning the color inside userColor to the painting color. Now there is a small problem in this, that I originally did not initialize the UI color. Well, actually, but I don't have a problem. I forgot that we called the change color from viewDidLoad. The problem I was saying is that if the user click on paint before they select the color, that userColor will not have been initialized. But I remember that we when the app loads, we call change color to set the color. So before the user have access to paint, the userColor would have been set with the initial values. So that's all what is needed to copy the color from the first screen to the second screen. So now I go back to the second controller, and in viewDidLoad I say use the color to change the background of the view. So the view here is a member of the current controller, so I say self.view, or you can just say view.background color equal painting color. So I was able to access view because view is the built-in outlet connection to the view or the screen view for that second screen. Now let's test it. So we did a lot of things. Actually, we added like 2 or 3 instructions, but the difficulty of what we just did is the fact that we did it in 2 separate controllers. We got 2 controllers that were separate, connected them to one another, and shared the data between them. So now I have a color here that is gray. Click paint, and you see the background is gray. Go back, change the color. Click paint, the color changes. Remember, in the testing, I said we're going to be testing on alpha 1. So don't put alpha to 0 or lower alpha, because here the alpha transitions to white, but in the paint the alpha transitions to black. So if you get alpha less than 1, you will see that it's trying to transition to nothing. So it's going to create a weird behavior. But here is that part, and we can now change a color on one screen and move to the second screen and see what this color, use that color as the background. This is again the completion of the required part of the project. Our next iteration is the same, but when you move to paint, instead of using the color as a background, we will use it as the brush color and make images and screens. So we'll go do that, but that is optional. So if you're happy where you are, you can just stop there and maybe watch the optional iteration at a later time. If you're excited, want to see how we can use the touch to paint, let's go ahead and do the second and last iteration, the iteration 8 or the remaining iteration.